In the previous lessons, we've been learning a lot about inheritance and managing our screens using a UI view controller. Now it's finally time to learn about segues so that we can navigate between our screens in the storyboard. Now, when we created our second view controller class entirely from scratch, it gave us a lot of control and allowed us to show you how we would inherit from UI view controller, how we could override the view.load method that came from the UI view controller, as well as tap into properties that come from the UI view controller as well. And we got to see the class as well as the object created from the class in their purest forms. But you saw how much work it was just to create a single label. Now imagine if we had to create the entire user interface. It would require over 50 lines of code. But luckily for us, there's a much easier way of presenting another screen. So let's go ahead and delete our second view controller file. And instead, we're going to go to File, New File. And this time, instead of choosing a Swift file, we're going to choose a CocoaTouch class. Now, CocoaTouch refers to the framework that Apple has created that includes UIKit and a whole bunch of other libraries that allows us to piggyback off their code and make our lives a little bit easier. In this case, the class that we're going to create is going to be called the Results View Controller, and it's going to be a subclass of our UI View Controller. Now go ahead and click Next, and then make sure that it gets grouped with the controllers, and then click Create. So now you should end up with a new file that already has UIKit imported, that already has UI View Controller as the superclass that we're inheriting from. And it should also have created the class called Result View Controller that's inside a file called resultviewcontroller.swift. It's also got the view.load already implemented, and all we have to do is to delete these comments and add our own custom code. Just as we have done before, where we have our IP outlets, our IP actions, and we link our design with our code, I'm going to use this result view controller as the code file that's going to control and manage this screen. So we've already designed the screen for you, but in order to link it up with this new file, go ahead and select it either with this little yellow button here, alternatively in the document outline. And then we're going to pop open the right-hand pane and go to the Identity Inspector, which is this one. Now we're going to set the class that controls the screen. And we're going to start typing result, and it should hopefully pick up on the name of our class here, which is Result View Controller. So you can go ahead and hit enter once it finds that. You can also click on the drop-down list and try to scroll through this list to find it as well, but I find it easier just typing. So now that this is linked up, when we go into the Assistant view, we should be able to start linking up some IB outlets and some IB actions. Now, occasionally, Xcode doesn't quite pick up on this link as fast as it should do. So when you select each of these view controllers in the main.storyboard, it should be automatically pulling up the linked file. So in this case, it's the viewcontroller.swift. But in this case, it actually hasn't clocked on yet. So what we have to do is go to Automatic and select the Result View Controller. So in your case, you might not have this confusion, and Xcode is always changing, always trying to improve. It might be that you don't have this and you see this Result View Controller come up straight away when you go into Assistant View. But at least on my copy at the moment, this is what I'm seeing. So this is how you can fix it. So now that we've got our code file and our design file side by side, let's go ahead and create some IB outlets and IB actions. So the first one that I need a reference to is the place where I'm going to display the BMI value. So I'm going to create an outlet here and I'll call that the BMI label. And then I'm going to create another outlet from this label here, which I'll just place below, and I'll call that the advice label. And finally, we're going to create a IB action from our recalculate button right at the bottom after view did load. So this action is going to be of type UI button. So that's the sender data type. And then the name is going to be recalculate pressed. So that's it, and we can go into our full screen of result view controller. And now we've got our two IB outlets and an IB action, and we're able to use the design that we've created in our interface builder. Now, this might be a good time to also rename our view controller.swift, because it's probably better if the name tells us straight away which screen it's managing in the main.storyboard. So you can see that when you select this view controller scene and you go into the identity inspector, you can see that this is where that class is showing up. Now you could manually go and change the file name, change the class name, and change the name of it in the identity inspector on the main.storyboard as well. But that's quite a lot of work. A much easier way of doing this is simply to right-click on the name of the class view controller, go to refactor and rename. And now Xcode should be able to pick up on all the places where we're using that name view controller, including the file name, the commenting, the class name, as well as in the main.storyboard. So right here, we're going to change this to the calculate view controller, and then go ahead and click rename for all of these places to be changed and updated. Now, occasionally Xcode might trip up when you try to rename the name of the file, and it doesn't actually change it over. So what you can do is you can go to controller and show in Finder, and inside that folder, make sure that the name of the file is calculate view controller.swift. If not, you can simply just click and then pause 1 second and then click again. If not, then you can simply just change its name here as well. And that should fix that problem. But otherwise, we've now got our two view controllers, each linked to a code file that inherits from UI view controller. And this result view controller is going to be the second screen that we want to display onto our app. Previously, we had to initialize the view controller manually using our code. If we go into main.storyboard, there's actually a much easier way of navigating to the next screen. We can simply create a segue. So if you select the calculate view controller, either in the document outline or this little yellow circle here in the main.storyboard, and you hold down your control key, then you can click and drag and point to the result view controller and then let go. And now you're going to select a segue, and we're going to select present modally. Now the segue is basically going to initiate a transition to the next screen. It's going to display the transition in an animated way, and you can choose your animation by simply selecting that little arrow that is representing the segue and then change the transition type. But we're going to keep everything as the default. And we're going to give this segue an identifier, so a way of being able to identify it through our code. And I'm going to call this go to results. And now we have a segue which will transition to the next screen, and we can trigger it by using that identifier, go to results. So now if we go ahead and copy this identifier so we don't make any typos in our code, and we go to our calculate view controller.swift, now here we're going to delete this line where we create our second view controller, because that doesn't really exist anymore. And I'm also going to delete these two lines as well. Instead of all of that, what we're going to do is we're going to use a method that every UI view controller has, and we've managed to inherit it by inheriting from UI view controller. So we can tap into our current calculate view controller, and from this view controller, we can trigger the method that's inherited called perform segue. So it's this one. And if we go ahead and hit enter, it should insert all of the parameters that we need to fill out. So in this case, in order to perform a segue, we have to put in the identifier, and that's of course the identifier of the segue, which you should have copied over, and you need to make sure that it's spelled exactly the same as what you had in the main.storyboard right here. And then we're going to specify the sender, so who is going to be the initiator of the segue, and it's of course our calculate view controller. So that is of course our self, our calculate view controller, the current class. And now if we run our app, and we click on calculate, you should see that it navigates to the next screen, which is our result view controller. So now it's just a matter of passing over the BMI value. Inside our result view controller, I'm going to create a new variable. So this is going to be a property of my result view controller, and I'm going to call it BMI value. And I'm going to set it as a optional string, because initially when I create my result view controller, I don't know what the BMI value is going to be. It's only when I've calculated the BMI, then can I actually pass it over. But now that the segue is responsible for initializing our result view controller, and I no longer have to initialize it manually, well, how can we set the BMI value property? If you take a look inside the result view controller, notice that when we created it, the template code also included a navigation section that's been commented out. You can see here it says that in a storyboard-based application, you'll often want to do a little preparation before navigation. And this is the method that you need to override in order to run some code just before the segue initiates. So in preparation for the segue. And in here, it has a comment that tells us if you want to get hold of a reference to the new view controller, well, you can simply use segue.destination. So you can either cut this and copy it over to our calculate view controller, or you can simply just write prepare for and find the prepare for segue method. And this is going to be a method that we inherit from UI view controller, which we're going to override. So inside here, we can tap into the sender.destination. And this sender.destination is going to be the view controller that will be initialized when the segue gets triggered. In a multi-screen app, it's more than possible that you could have multiple screens that all originate from one screen. So let's say that I was to find another view controller and I was to drag it onto the screen, and I also have a segue from my calculate view controller to this other view controller. Well, now I've kind of got two segues, right? I've got one that goes here and one that goes here, and they both start from the calculate view controller. And when either of those segues are performed, the prepare for segue method will get triggered. So to be able to differentiate between our segues, or at least in a potential future where there might be a clash, we should first check to see if the segue dot identifier is equal to the identifier that we assigned to the one that goes to the results screen, this one. So let's check to see if segue identifier is equal to go to result, spelt exactly the same way again. And then in that case, well, we know that we've narrowed down on the actual correct segue. So now what we can do is we can create a reference to that new view controller that's going to be initialized when the segue gets performed. So let's create a constant called destination VC, and we're going to set it to equal segue.destination. Now, this destination is the view controller that will be initialized when the segue gets performed, and it has a type of UI view controller. So even though we know that for a fact, when the go-to result segue gets triggered, then it's definitely going to be this one, which will initialize a result view controller. But if we tried to say destination VC dot BMI value, well, we're going to get an error because it says UI view controllers don't have BMI values. And indeed, that is true. So why is it not picking up on this property that we have in our result view controller? Well, it's because that the segue.destination has a data type of UI view controller, and therefore our destination VC is also a UI view controller. But the BMI value only exists within our result view controller. So in order to narrow it down to say that the segue destination is actually a result view controller, we can say as !results view controller. And as soon as we do that, then it recognizes the BMI value and our destination VC turns into a result view controller data type. So now we can set this BMI value to 0.0 and all of our code is now error-free. Now, why is it that we had to do this, and what does it mean when we write as? Well, remember that we're overriding this prepare for segue method, and that when Apple created this method, they didn't know that we were going to create a result view controller. They didn't know about a BMI value that we needed to set. So what they've done is that the segue will initialize a box standard UI view controller. Now it's our job to narrow down the data type and specify the exact data type that the destination will be. So by using this as keyword, we are effectively performing something called downcasting. At the moment, we have a UI view controller, which of course is the superclass of our result view controller. We can cast it down to a result view controller by writing the keyword as. Now, the exclamation mark here says this is going to be a forced downcast. So just as when we use the exclamation mark to unwrap optionals, this expresses our certainty that when the segues identify as go to result, then the destination view controller that gets created is definitely going to be a result view controller. So now, can you use what you've learned and what you know to try and get the BMI value that we calculated inside calculate pressed over into our prepare for segue so that we can actually set the destination VC's BMI value to the actual calculated value rather than just 0.0. There's a few bits of code that you'll need to change, but the end result, if you're successful, is you should be able to change the height and weight toggles, click on calculate, and you should end up with the actual BMI result being passed over and displayed in this BMI label. Pause the video and see if you can complete this challenge. Alright, so at the moment we know that we've got our BMI being calculated in the calculate pressed IB action, but we actually need that value in our prepare for segue method. So how do we move it over? Well, one of the easiest ways is to simply create a variable in our calculate view controller. So we can call it BMI value, and we can set it to start off being equal to 0.0. And then when we calculate our BMI, we can format it so that we only get it to one decimal place. So we could say BMI value is equal to a string that is formatted with this particular format. So it's going to be %.1f And then the value that we want to format is, of course, that BMI floating point number that we got here. And so now we've got our BMI value stored at the top level, and we can place it in here as the value that we'll pass over. So now when our segue gets triggered, we'll pass over the BMI value to our destination VC, which is our result view controller, and it should land in here. Now, when this view loads up, we can set the BMI labels text property to equal the BMI value. Now, if we hit run, you'll see that our calculated BMI gets passed over and displayed in our result view controller. So now that you've seen how we can use these segues to move forwards, going from one screen to the next, how do we go backwards? How can we dismiss this screen and show the one previous? So I'm going to delete this view controller because we're only working with these two. And you might think that the solution is to create a segue, well, this way back. But actually, there's a much easier way. If you go into your result view controller, the time point where we actually want to remove this result view controller from the app and instead show the previous screen, which is our calculate view controller, is when the user presses the recalculate button. So inside this IB action, we can simply tap into a method that again comes from our UI view controller, and we can call it by simply writing self.dismiss. And this will dismiss the current view controller, which is of course our result view controller. So if we go ahead and insert that code, we can set the animated property to true so that the transition happens in an animated way. And we can set the completion to nil so that nothing happens after we dismiss it. We just go back to the previous screen. And if we now run our app, you can see that we're able to go forwards by clicking on the calculate button, which triggers the segue, and go backwards by clicking on the recalculate button, which dismisses that second screen, the result view controller. Now, here's something I want to show you. When we create apps that have multiple screens, what essentially happens is that the newer screens gets laid on top of the previous screens like a stack of pancakes. And if you want to see them in 3D, then you can simply make sure that your app is running and then click on this particular icon. And it will show you what's currently displayed in the app. But if you click and move, you can see it in 3D. You can see that our result view controller is simply overlaid on top of the calculate view controller. So once we dismiss this view controller, then we go back to our previous screen. You can also see where our labels lie on top and relative to other user interface elements, and it's a really handy way of debugging what's going on with our UI. So that's just a neat trick. Now that we've figured out how to go forwards by creating a segue in the storyboard and then triggering it by calling perform segue, which comes from our superclass that we're inheriting, the UI view controller, and then we're able to prepare for that segue by setting some properties in the destination of the segue, and finally we're able to dismiss the presented view controller by calling the dismiss method, which again we have access to because it comes from the UI view controller, which we're inheriting from. Now, of course, Swift is smart enough to know that we're using the dismiss method from this current class. So in fact, the self keyword is not necessary. In some cases, especially when we're creating initializers, it's quite helpful to use the self keyword to make it easier to understand what's going on. So it's up to you whether if you want to keep it or if you want to simply delete it and keep your code clean. But that's how we can create segues and how we can go backwards and forwards and navigate through our multi-screen app. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to continue building out our app, and we're going to modify more of our result view controller by changing the background color depending on the BMI, changing the advice, and making our app conform to the MVC design pattern. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson.